Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our online forum, which is titled From Pilot to Policy, Elevating Evaluation, Results, and Research in Policymaking. I'm Amy Rowley-McGee, the president of the Health Policy Institute of Ohio. The mission of our organization is to advance evidence-informed policies that improve health, achieve equity, and lead to sustainable healthcare spending. We'd like to begin by thanking our core funders whose support of HPIO's mission with their steadfast investment in our work enables us to produce many publications and educational events like today. And then we'd like to particularly thank VI3 because they dedicated some funding for our Pilot to Policy project. Thank you also to all of our educational event series sponsors for their generous support of our forum series. We look forward to engaging with you throughout today's event and encourage you to put questions in the chat or in the question and answer box during the webinar. We will be monitoring both and will answer questions as time permits. The slides and other information shared today will be on our website under the category Events. And I think Haley will likely drop a link to that part of our website here shortly. Throughout Ohio, there are many people and organizations, including you who are participating in today's webinar, who are involved in designing and implementing programs with the aim of improving health and well-being in our communities. As partners in both the public and the private sectors develop innovative ideas to address Ohio's health challenges, evaluating results, communicating skillfully with state and local leaders about what works, and investing in sustaining evidence-informed approaches will make the most effective use of our limited resources. In 2023, HPIO created 2 resources to assist stakeholders and policymakers in taking lessons learned from promising health and human services pilot programs and developing policy and systems change. The first of those 2 briefs included considerations for state and local policymakers who are considering which programs to champion, which programs to invest in, and how to know whether a program has proven or promising results. The second brief includes recommendations, tools, and resources for program staff and others on how to evaluate program outcomes, communicate those findings successfully, and overcome barriers to achieving policy or systems change. So we encourage you to take a look at those publications if you haven't already. They are also posted on our website. But during today's event, we're going to explore all of the concepts that are included in these briefs further and hear from leaders in our state about how data and evidence informs policymaking here in Ohio. Here are our objectives for today's forum. I'll give you a few seconds to read them. Whether you're a person who works in a state agency or a local health department, a legislator or a legislative aide, someone who makes funding decisions, or you're a person who develops and implements programs, our hope is that you leave today's webinar with a few key takeaways that are helpful for you and the people you serve. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sarah Needler. Sarah is the Associate Director for State Impact at Results for America. Sarah previously served as the Director of Research at the Council of State Governments, where she led evidence-based policymaking initiatives, among other efforts. Sarah, thank you for joining us today to talk about the potential for impact in evidence-based policymaking.
Thank you so much, Amy, and excited to talk today, as Amy said, about the impact, but also the general opportunity there is around evidence-based policymaking and how it can have a huge impact in government. Next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. And we can actually go to the next one as well.
You're controlling, you're good, Sarah.
Oh, all right, thank you so much. So we look at the opportunity around evidence-based policymaking first at what the opportunity is on a funding basis. So there is more than $2 trillion spent at the local, state, and federal government level each year to support our most vulnerable populations. And this amount is actually not including the funding that's spent on Medicaid and Medicare. So we know that it's even a much grander opportunity than the $2 trillion a year. And this is investments that really we have the opportunity to turn directly into equitable economic mobility outcomes. And this can happen by utilizing this money and utilizing government funding towards services with evidence of effectiveness, while also taking into account how we can prioritize the priorities of communities. Another part of this opportunity is that we do have a lot of knowledge about what works and what evidence there is around programs that we might want to implement. There are over 2,000 strategies that we know have been demonstrated to work, or evidence-based practices or policies. And these can be found in nonprofit and government clearinghouses. There's a few examples listed here on this slide, including the Results for America Economic Mobility Catalog, as well as the Results First Clearinghouse, which you might actually hear about from one of our other speakers today. And these clearinghouses have information from research and is trying to distill all that research into what impact this program might have for someone else if they were to choose to implement it. And I do want to note that at first glance, these clearinghouses can maybe seem a little bit intimidating, but we do know that they are used and are an important tool. There was a recent survey of nonprofits, and actually more than half of the respondents said that they were implementing one of these clearinghouses or using one of these clearinghouses pretty regularly. Another aspect of why this is such a huge opportunity is because we also have a lot of research and knowledge about policymakers caring about this work and caring about evidence. In one state survey, this was in Minnesota, about 97% of legislative and executive branch policymakers that were part of this research reported that having information on the effectiveness of a program is really an important aspect of their decision making. However, only about 50% or half of those folks were satisfied with the information that they currently have access to. So there's really a good opportunity to provide more information on data and evidence to policymakers. And another experiment was conducted with policymakers where they were presented with different proposals and then asked to hypothetically select which proposal they would choose to fund. And they were about 22% more likely to select a proposal that had rigorous evaluation or an evidence-based label on the proposal. A last part of the opportunity that we're working with around evidence-based policymaking is that there are a lot of opportunities for change that are currently unutilized. So a lot of times organizations, researchers, legislators, government leaders will think about things like the legislative process, think about things like the permit budgets. But we're not necessarily thinking about the inside game behind all of that work, which includes writing grant funding opportunities, designing those budget templates, thinking about what spending goals might be. And those are all levers in this process that are really changeable and can be used to prioritize evidence and therefore have a huge impact. And I'll go into some of these things you see on the slide in detail here in just a moment. But first, I wanted to also share an example of why this is such a great opportunity. And not only because we're excited about evidence and we know what works, because it actually leads to improved outcomes and better outcomes, better health outcomes, better education results for the folks that we're working with. This is just one specific example that I wanted to share from Tennessee. Recently, this was in 2021, the Tennessee General Assembly passed the Learning Loss Remediation and Student Acceleration Act. And this was an act to make sure that local education agencies and public charter schools were implementing programs to address recovery learning loss from COVID-19. Tennessee then decided to use these funds partially for evidence-based summer learning programs and summer learning camps. These programs, when they were implemented, were evaluated by the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, and they found that this program led to improved student learning outcomes, especially around math. And this was learning outcomes where they were measuring them immediately in the fall after these summer learning camps. So we had improved student learning outcomes, and this was especially true for math scores, also for elementary students, non-white and economically disadvantaged students. But this is just to show how all the things that we're talking about today can actually have a huge impact in people's lives. Now, the last few minutes, I just want to give an overview of some of the strategies for increasing the impact of government funding. These are sort of that inside game that I was talking about earlier. One of the methods is to think about piloting projects, evaluating projects. How do we scale projects that we know that work? But there are other components that we also think are really great opportunities for making that change and having that impact that I want to make sure to highlight. The first step in all of this work, and we think it's a very important first step, is to think about how does the state, how does the agency, how does the government want to define evidence-based? I have a couple of definitions listed here on this slide, which are definitions from Results for America. And you'll see that we actually do use two different definitions, one for an evidence-based program and one for an evidence-building program. And that's to make sure that we are also giving the opportunity for programs that might not yet have a research base, but that in implementing it and collecting data, we'll be able to collect that information to know whether or not it has been effective. Very similar to pilot projects that you might be working on. There are several states that you can see here on this slide that do have a statewide evidence definition or framework. Beyond this, there are several state agencies that have their own definition. I know Colorado is in the brief that you maybe have read before joining us here today. They have a evidence continuum. And many of these states actually think about evidence on a continuum or having different tiers of evidence, really acknowledging that it might look different for different programs, which I think is a really great thing to think about. After defining evidence, there are a lot of different ways that you can use that definition and really prioritize evidence in policymaking and practice. One of those ways is through implementing evidence-based direct services. And this is really in line with what we were talking about, those pilot projects, implementing programs that we already know are effective and have an evidence base. These things are all important, but I also want to emphasize that other things we want to take into account when implementing evidence-based programs are things like community priorities, what existing resources and capacity we might have to implement these projects, making sure we're thinking about not only implementing this intervention for the general population, but thinking about what kind of impact it could have for our most vulnerable populations. We can access information about what direct services we might want to use or might want to implement from the clearinghouses that I talked about earlier. And then once these are being implemented, continuing to collect data about what's working, what maybe isn't working, and just continuing that ongoing monitoring and evaluation. I do want to mention a couple of examples of states that are doing a good job at this and a good job of just thinking about evidence-based direct services systematically, and that's Minnesota and Tennessee. They both have program inventories where they actually look at all state-funded programs and determine whether or not their program is supported by evidence. So those are great opportunities and great websites that you can look into if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Thirdly, incorporating evidence in the budget process. So this is one where we probably don't talk about it quite as much, but is really a huge opportunity, especially in state government. There are a lot of different steps and a lot of opportunities that you can see listed out here on the slide to incorporate evidence in the budget process. What we usually see this looking like is having a form on, or having a box on the budget template form that actually asks about the evidence behind the project that's being proposed. Also, there's a lot of states who provide support to agencies when they're thinking about how do I develop this evidence-based budget request. Making sure that decision materials and the process itself has an opportunity to think about what the evidence is when we're making these funding decisions. And then another opportunity would be setting evidence-based targets. This would be something like saying that 50% of programming from the Department of Education must be evidence-based programs. And the last one on there is thinking about reporting the evidence basis of each line item or proposal item in public documents, whether that be items that are signed into law or public budget documents like the governor's budget. There are actually 10 states that we're aware of that incorporate evidence in the budget process. And Ohio is one of those states, which is exciting. We actually worked with Director Kim Murnix in the fall for a webinar where we were highlighting best practices in the states around evidence-based policymaking. And this is something that Ohio does have a box on the form to provide evidence behind proposals. And this is something we're hoping to work with Kim and her team a little bit more on as well as time goes on. And last but not least, another great opportunity for prioritizing evidence would be through all of the grant funding that a state is putting out or giving to recipients. There are a couple different strategies that RFA uses to think about how to prioritize evidence in grants and contracts. The first one would be through requiring that whatever is being funded must be evidence-based. So an example of this would be the Tennessee High Dosage Tutoring Program, which prioritizes evidence by funding high dosage tutoring, which is an evidence-based program that you can find on clearinghouses. Another strategy would be to allocate extra points to grant applications that meet the government's evidence definition. So the Texas Workforce Commission's Building Construction Trades Program is an example of that. For that particular grant program and their request for applications, they award extra points, extra 10 points, if the proposal has a level of causal evidence. And we actually know that this is happening across several states, including Ohio. There are about 34 states that we've identified grant programs that define and prioritize evidence. And you can see a link here, and we will have the link in the chat, but also I think on the website to be able to explore what those grant programs look like. So I know this is very much a high-level overview of some of the opportunities around evidence-based policymaking, but I'm going to leave it at that and also just thank you for letting me join you, and always happy to talk more, also provide support if any of these things are things you might want to work on together. I have my email address here on the screen, which you're welcome to use. Thanks so much, and I'll pass it back over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a fantastic presentation. You covered a lot of ground in a very brief amount of time. I'll just pause here a second to allow folks to put some of their thoughts or questions in the Q&A box. I do have one question, though, for you. The Tennessee program that you mentioned, that was a result of legislation, the Learning Loss Remediation and Student Acceleration Act. That went into effect in 2021, and already there have been results as related to it?
Yeah, that's correct. I'll have to look back of when the evaluation was actually shared, and that's something I can also share in the chat as well.
Okay.
But this is something from the beginning they were thinking about evaluation and thinking about collecting data. So it was something that very much happened in real time, which was great.
That's wonderful. This sounded like amazing results in a pretty brief amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, any questions? Let's see. I see. Oh, there is
Yeah.
a question.
Amy
Here-
and Sarah, I'm happy to jump in if that's okay. I've reviewed the questions and we have two questions and they're quite similar, which is great. So we're getting these questions about how we balance the need for innovation and funding programs that have that, what you called evidence building sort of aspect versus programs that are evidence-based. And just thinking about the fact that evidence-based programs can be quite expensive to run, and how we balance that with the need to innovate or do things that maybe we see work in practice but don't have that rigorous evidence base attached.
That's a great question. I love that people are thinking about that. Like you mentioned, and kind of how RFA has approached this is really thinking through our evidence definitions and making sure we're providing that separate pathway of not only implementing programs that we already know are evidence-based, but also being able to build new evidence. So I think that's something where it's going to potentially look different at each state. It might look a little bit different for each agency of what amount of these programs or how much of our grant funding do we want to put towards programs that we know have an evidence base versus using it maybe to explore other opportunities that we don't necessarily know if it works yet. So I think a good way to do that would be maybe setting those thresholds. Maybe even in one particular grant program itself, you'd be able to give two different paths, right? Where you're going to get those extra points maybe if you are proposing a program that has an evidence base, or equally you'd be able to get those points if you're proposing a new program that might not yet have evidence base, but that you're willing to collect data, to collect all the information possible so that you at the end of the day be able to report on whether or not it was effective or not. And then being able to kind of hopefully in real time be able to adapt and make changes to make the program as effective as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you for that response. I really appreciated how you clearly differentiated between evidence-based programs and evidence-building programs. That is, I think, a way to succinctly describe how important both are. And in particular, I think Scott included this in his question, how you can take an evidence-based program and apply it in a different setting, and perhaps in that setting it becomes an evidence building program because you want to assess it under different circumstances as well. Does that sound like accurate to you too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an important consideration that I didn't dig into too much, but when thinking about implementing the program, it is really important to think about who are you implementing it for and where are you implementing it, because that could change the story entirely. And so it's important, even if we are implementing a program that is evidence-based, to still collect that information and make sure in the context we're implementing it that it still has the impact that we're hoping it to have.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. We appreciate your insights today.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Okay. Well, now we're going to move on to Dr. Max Crowley. He is a professor of human development, family studies, and public policy at Pennsylvania State University. He also holds several other roles at the university, including, and there's 3 of them, so stay with me here, the director for the Edna Bennett Pierce Prevention Research Center, the director of the Evidence to Impact Collaborative, and the co-director of the Research to Policy Collaboration. Dr. Crowley's research focuses on methods for conducting economic evaluations of health and social programs and developing strategies to improve the use of evidence in policy and budget making. Welcome, Dr. Crowley.
Thank you, Amy. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And Sarah, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. The work that you and Results for America is doing is always inspiring because it's so thoughtful and comprehensive. And I have the pleasure to build on that today. I believe I have control of the slides now. I do. Yes. So I'll be talking about going a little bit deeper in terms of and building on what Sarah was discussing around how do we actually communicate about research evidence in the policy context? How do we actually go about doing the thing of getting all of those great examples that Sarah shared from across the country what is the process, right? And what more, maybe even more importantly, is the relational needs that happens through this work. So one of the hats I do wear is around is directing the Evidence to Impact Collaborative. And so the Evidence to Impact Collaborative is a center here at Penn State University, and we focus on the science of improving the use of research, right, of improving scientific impact. So we actually think about the way that we go about supporting evidence use in government, right, across levels. How do we actually do that in a systematic and replicable way, right? And most importantly, I think for many folks on the call, how do we do it in a way that's efficient, that it fits into the organizational processes and needs, both within the practitioner community as well as with our government partners. And I think that this is of particular importance as we consider, well, it's great, these are amazing, but I think everyone else is like, but I'm already doing so much. How do I do this too? And that becomes the really important element of like, well, what are the things, the actual actionable steps that we can take to communicate around where there's evidence, to use that evidence for decision making, and then ultimately to achieve our goals of providing better and higher quality services that improve health and well-being. So a little bit of background here, we do a lot of work at the Evidence to Impact Collaborative around understanding sort of the trends in evidence use, right, across a whole host of different areas. This is one landscape scan that we did around adverse childhood experiences and the growth of that concept, the concept that there's early life adversities that compound upon each other. And as a result, right, services and supports need to address each of those experiences, those traumas individually, as well as an overall syndrome. So this is a concept that really took off beginning in the early 2000s, as you can see. And so we have, for instance, these are family legislation introduced all across the country, including for Ohio, that it referenced adverse childhood experiences, and then those that actually used scientific evidence as part, for instance, of that legislative effort. Similarly, we also look at a lot around the public statements coming out of government, right? So everything from social media to floor votes to media engagements to policy documents coming out of agencies, regulatory language. And we look and think about where evidence is used there. Sort of as Sarah was mentioning, there's so much different types of policymaking behavior that is really can be addressed and looked at. So this is sort of the orientation we're coming from. So Sarah mentioned too, like that there's different ways of kind of going about this work. One thing that she mentioned was the results first clearinghouse. So that's a clearinghouse of clearinghouses, if you will. So there are lots of lists out there that say, oh, this program's evidence-based, or this program's promising, or this program's not, doesn't have an evidence yet. And so we do a lot of work around synthesizing and bringing those clearinghouses together. And then within that context, we think about structural models, actual models for understanding what I was mentioning at the beginning of a moment ago, in terms of how do we, in a replicable fashion, actually start these conversations around evidence, and then ultimately see some of these opportunities, whether they're legislative, whether they're executive, whether they're at federal level or state or local level. How do we actually kind of get them going? One of those models is the research to policy collaboration model, a model that my colleague Taylor Scott and I developed and have been using to test sort of and develop different very actionable strategies for supporting and improving the use of evidence, right? By bridging scientific communities, practice communities, and legislative communities. Here, for instance, we look at the relationship between legislative and research communities in a 7-step process for how we engage, right? That starts with understanding policy communities' needs through structured needs assessments, while simultaneously building research and practice communities' ability to have the capacity to talk fluently with our government partners, recognizing that if we want to see evidence used, that we need to be sensitive and conscientious of the time constraints and incentives that occur within government, because the goal, of course, is to have it in those policy spaces. So this work, this model, this research to policy collaboration model, we think a lot about how we can build connections, right? And this is, I think, one of the most important things, and part of the secret sauce of groups like Results for America and others is the relational element between government partners, those who are in policymaking or decision-making places of authority, and those who have evidence or creating evidence, right, or want to use evidence-based programs, how we can bridge those relationships, how we can build those relationships, because that's where the conversations happen. That's where the action happens. So we've done a variety of different assessments with this specific model. That there are others as well, but the research to policy collaboration model has been very fruitful in that we've seen its ability to facilitate, or what we'll often refer to as elicit, right, a need for scientific evidence, right? And I think many of y'all probably have had these conversations, which is we're someone who's in a policy space, right, asks like, I'd really like to know what works here, right? Or how do I understand the problem here? Why is this happening, right? And for the practice community and the scientific community, we sometimes do a good job of answering those questions, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes that's because the evidence, right, isn't there. And sometimes that's because we're not necessarily as coordinated as we could be. And that's part of this work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So for instance, this work was part of some of that pilot evaluation where we look at, well, what are the types of evidence that are often requested and needed by government partners, right? We have all sorts of preconceived ideas about what we think folks in policy spaces should be doing, right? But where is the need, right? Where is the actual perceived need, right? And so this is some of the areas, right? So reviewing what are the intervention strategies, what works, right? Summarizing like the problem, the etiology, how a problem came about, right? Identifying existing policies. So for instance, as I mentioned, some of our landscape work helps us connect one state with another state that's doing incredible work in that area. Sarah, I think, gave some great examples, right, of where one state is really leading on their thinking in a specific domain, and those are great opportunities for cross-state engagement. We also, one thing that we think a lot about, as I mentioned before, is the efficiency of doing this work, right? And so for each of you, you have your organizations, or you yourselves are in government, and we think about the hours. So this is a graph figure, right, of the amount of time that's required to actually carry out the process of getting, for instance, launching or crafting an evidence-based policy, right? So for us, so this one work was done at the federal level, and I'll start some of my examples at that level. But in federal policy spaces, so this need for policy identification, that's sort of 7 steps, right? Developing and supporting the practice and research communities, and building that capacity, engaging in those needs assessments. This work, for instance, then has like an on-site, in-person event, and then of course, the real meat of it is that strategic kind of planning and that work in terms of actually then crafting the policy or developing the RFP or some sort of regulatory framework, right, in concert with practice and research communities. And as you can see, the timing, the amount of time, right, with green being, with blue in this case being practice and scientific community, the legislative, and in this case, legislative offices, right, there's a lot of pre-work that happens in green in terms of that intermediary function. Groups like Results for America often play this intermediary role where they're trying to speak and support the practice and scientific community's goals, right, and work with government partners. So we want to really recognize, and I know Sarah shares this feeling now, that this is hard work, right, and it requires time and effort and sort of strategic engagement. But so this pilot work, right, led us to ask the question, but how do we know like this model works, right? How do we know any of these models work, right? There's great anecdotal information, really nice stories about how intermediaries have done the work and and led on engagement and held events and all of that stuff. But how do we know that we're actually like moving the needle? And part of this comes down to the fundamental question of, folks outside government are always saying, well, we really want to see evidence-based policies being made. We want you to be using the science, using the evidence, using the wisdom of the practice communities in your decision-making, right, to craft that evidence-based policy. But we really recognized about 10 years ago that we lacked a lot of evidence about how to do that. We didn't have evidence-based strategies to support research use, to support evidence use. And so that led us to a very interesting line of work that we wanted to share with you all today in terms of really emphasizing, like, there are ways to do this that we know can be effective, right? And we can know are an efficient use of your time if you're outside or inside of government. In particular, so I'll use our federal example first. So we took that research to policy collaboration model, that RPC model, and we actually randomized congressional offices to either receive the supports of that model or not. We randomized 96 different offices. We treated it just like you would treat a clinical trial for a vaccine, right? Registered it and everything. And what we did was we provided the supports that I was just mentioning, right? That connections with the research and practice community, building the capacity of those communities to actually work directly with government partners, with these congressional offices, as well as helping those government offices, congressional offices articulate their needs for scientific evidence. It was a really interesting kind of exercise because we really hadn't thought about this sort of at the meta level that the things that we can be doing to communicate, to work with government partners could actually, to facilitate evidence-based policymaking, could in fact be done systematically and evaluated as a behavioral intervention for the entire community. I won't get too deep into the methods, but we had a very kind of wide-ranging assessment of supports around doing that work. And then ultimately what we found was we had surveys, we looked at the legislation coming out of offices, we looked at, we had an ethnographer, an independent ethnographer follow this work around. And what we saw was that we, in fact, were able to move the needle on a congressional office's value for scientific evidence, right? How much they actually valued it in terms of the utility for their work. But of course, that wasn't the end goal. The end goal wasn't to increase the value. It raised the question of, well, did we actually change how, in this case, how congressional offices was writing and introducing bills? And this work was around child and family health policy. And what we saw was we didn't change the number of bills, right, that were coming out of those intervention offices, the offices that were assigned to receive these supports. What we did see was an increase in and a change in the legislative language of those bills. Those bills were at a significantly higher rate, almost a 20% more scientific evidence was being referenced in the bills coming out of the offices that were receiving these supports, to have that direct engagement, to develop those collaborative and appropriate relationships with practice and research communities, sort of providing real evidence to something that I think we all know on some level, right? But really that this is an effective strategy for changing this work. So I want to talk a little bit more about the state work, because as you might imagine, like some of this work I mentioned, like intervening with Congress and things like that are kind of, you know, quite resource intensive. But what we've done is actually identify a variety of strategies that take these principles, take what we've learned, and can bring it down to executable things that really any practice or organization, any group that is themselves, you know, trying to develop the evidence can create to help and support our partners in government in using scientific evidence. One of those things that we do is something around optimization of science communication. And so through this, we use iterative trials, experimental trials, where we randomize not just members of Congress, but those in federal government, within agencies, within legislative settings, as well as in state and state executive agencies and within the state legislatures. So these iterative trials test different frames for how we can communicate about our science, about what we're discovering, right? What we're seeing, what the lessons from the practice communities are, what the lessons from the scientific research is showing. So for instance, we see when we frame evidence-based solutions as a problem framed messages. So in this sort of upper corner here, what we'll see is that when we actually have a significant change in how individuals interact with the scientific evidence, right, that's sort of being offered, or with the type of programs that are being described, right? The opportunity here being, of course, that we like to sort of be positive, but in reality, often in many government settings, the role is to be very reactive, right? And so the identification of a problem and the tying the work to that problem, right, often can be very helpful. We've seen this across different areas, as you can see, everything from issues around police minority contact, supporting linguistically diverse students, issues around violence against sexual and gender minorities, right? This problem framed approach will increase whether or not basically different policy communities, both in the executive and legislative communities, will engage with your messaging when you reach out to communicate. In a similar fashion, we've had, I know that one of the goals of the organization is focusing on issues of equity. And as many of you know, talking about equity can be tricky and be difficult, right? For a variety of reasons. How we frame that, how we talk about that can have statistically and clinically significant differences on how different policy communities will engage or won't engage with evidence-based solutions, with evidence-based strategies. So for instance, we see conversations around where there's around racial justice that explicitly mention threat language. So for instance, unequal threats for individuals during COVID, threats to the health of various communities. These are the type of messages that can be really helpful for facilitating engagement with solutions, evidence-based solutions to address, for instance, social disparities of health, right? Similarly, as many of y'all probably already know, we see huge effects for the personalization of messages. They're, of course, very time intensive and labor intensive to do that, depending on how you communicate with different audiences. But it is such a relational process, right? Working and supporting evidence use. All right. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, great, thanks.
Can you just go back?
Yeah, of course.
Well, this is really very interesting, and I want to make sure I'm understanding.
Yeah.
Were any of these messages, like regardless of which trial they were in, effective with engaging legislators or other policymakers, or were some more effective than others?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry if that wasn't clear. Thank you so much for stopping me. So yes. So for instance, when we frame when we communicate with legislative communities around a problem, right? That leads to a much higher engagement rate, right? Sometimes 10, 20% increase in engagement with legislative as well as executive agency staff, right? Similarly, this threat language can be very helpful, as well as the personalization. So
okay, so really any of those,
and we see it consistently across different areas of health policy. So
that's really interesting because there's other research, but I think it's more focused on the general population.
Yep, that's right.
It kind of shows the opposite.
That's right.
So this is super interesting, but it does make sense because of the position that legislators and folks in executive branch agencies are in, needing to kind of respond to things rapidly.
Yeah, and I think that some of our colleagues from government that are here from today may even be able to speak to this firsthand than we can. But you know, I think that the reality is that right, our elected officials, our folks in agencies are there to solve pressing problems, right? And so whereas people in general everyday public, like we're already bombarded with so many problems and things like that language doesn't often resonate with the population. So there's all sorts of interesting social psychology that underlies this work.
Okay, I'll let you continue.
Yeah,
I just wanted to make sure I was clear on that.
Yeah. No, this is great. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to have Q&A, and I'll have my contact information for afterwards.
Great.
One thing that we also want to mention is that the way that we communicate with government communities shows up not only like in, will they engage with you? Will they take that meeting? Will they have the conversation? Can we keep the conversation going? But it actually demonstrates itself in other spaces too. So for instance, we did another randomized control trial of about 4,000 state legislators in the country. So and what we found when we provided a series of optimized science communication that use some of these very tools that I was mentioning just a moment ago, what we found was those who received those messages with those tools versus some of the other types of messaging, we saw a significant difference not only in their engagement, but also in how they talked about scientific evidence in things like social media, right? So this was during COVID, and we saw a significant change in how they talked about scientific evidence in their social media just based on a series of emails, right, where we were providing information to them. No in-person meeting, no Zoom meeting, no webinar, right? Just how we were basically framing the science. We could then link it to their social media, and we saw significant differences there. So just sort of wanting to emphasize the power of being really thoughtful with how we frame when we talk about evidence, right? Just being evidence-based is not enough, and it's certainly not the only consideration, as Sarah so nicely put forward, that our policy communities are having to consider. So if you can put the right framing around it, then you can elevate the importance and the willingness of folks to engage. So, okay. So what does this tell us, right? It tells us that dissemination is necessary, but it's also not sufficient, right? The relational component and how we frame our science becomes super important, right? Especially as we think about health policy and broadly defined in the fast-moving policy windows that surround this, right? The time to intervene is always, yesterday, as soon as you know about the problem. So timely and relevant work is needed, but also the need for appropriate and sustained collaboration. So we see, right, the longer you build and the more you build a relationship, right? So when practice communities, research communities, and policy communities come together, the more effective those groups are in, for instance, achieving some of the really amazing successes that Sarah mentioned earlier. So again, sort of what the science tells us is policymakers prefer people, right? So another kind of tidbit that is actionable for many of you is that we actually see that when we have like a relatively nicely sort of formatted, newsletter that goes out specifically to policy audiences, not to necessarily the general public, we see, kind of a medium level of clicks like within the first 6 to 12 hours. But when we send out emails that look totally organic, still personalized, right? Same information, but don't necessarily have all of that slick formatting and sort of around them, we actually see that policy communities are much more likely, 10 times as likely to interact with an email that looks personalized and looks like it was dashed off, right? Than, for instance, a really slick, well-done newsletter, which can be great for engaging general audiences, for funding communities, all of that. It's not to dismiss that, but that authentic communication, right? Policymakers prefer people, right? So science frames also requires a lot of transparency. It's really important to sort of indicate who you are, what you're about, if you have biases. We coach a lot of scientists on like, who are your funders, these type of things. We see the same type of things within practice communities, right? It's important. It's such a relational process, getting evidence used, that transparency becomes very important. Also, officials have different engagement styles, right? I think that different policy communities, different agencies have different work cultures. Legislatures we see have different cultures within them, among staff and among members. And so what we'll often see is that there are individuals who will always open science communication messages, but then there's also many of us that many that we find that never open, right? No matter how it's framed or who it comes from. Like, we've worked with leading organizations, all around the world that have great open rates, but there are some individuals that will never engage with your messages, right? And then there's these rarely and intermittent openers on different types of science communication messages. This is really important too, right, to consider, is that it's not, you're not going to win them all, right? What you're looking, of course, is to cultivate champions around evidence. And then finally, context matters. So the context in which you're coming, the policy window, what's happening at the moment, right? Policymakers don't have the time to necessarily hear about like the thing that you wish they would do, right? They often have a problem in front of them. They're trying to solve it. Understanding that context becomes incredibly important. Okay. So thank you very much, Amy. Thank you everyone for the opportunity to share some of this. I'm super excited to engage with folks more after the fact. And thank you to the team, in particular, my colleague Taylor Scott, who we've been working on this for the last decade and sort of developing and gleaning some of these insights. So thanks again, Amy.
Thank you, Max. We really appreciate you sharing all of that research. I'm going to need to take some time and go back and digest all of your slides after this. It was fabulous. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, Max, that if you wouldn't mind taking a look at those. We're going to move on to our legislative panel, but also want to make sure we're responsive to those questions. Thank you so much. Well, now I'd like to welcome our two guests from the Ohio General Assembly. To Max's point, these are people who also happen to be policymakers. Senator Michelle Reynolds is serving her first term in the Ohio Senate. She has a track record of focusing on results throughout her career. For example, in her work facilitating affordable housing for returning citizens. And we also have with us Representative Allison Russo, who is the minority leader in the Ohio House of Representatives and is serving her third term. As a health policy researcher for many years, Leader Russo's entire career has been focused on generating evidence related to healthcare costs and access. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Amy, for having us.
Good morning. Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful that you were able to be with us. So we have some questions that you've received in advance, and I'll work through those. And then we also invite those who are participating in today's webinar to again put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll pause periodically to respond to those. So I guess I'll start with Leader Russo. What role do data and research play in your decisions about which programs and services to support?
Well, Amy, I will say just based on my background, so I happen to be fortunate. I come to the General Assembly with a 20+ year career in the health services research space, leading actually evaluation projects. So it's a little bit of a unique perspective that I come to because I was often on the other end developing data for decision making. And applying, figuring out how we could apply that to policy. So for me, it starts with the data, but I probably am a little bit unique for most policymakers because I would say in general, a lot of the work that we do here most often starts with personal stories. Probably more anecdotal data. It certainly can expand from there, but very often very hyper localized view on an issue. As it moves forward, of course, that expands. So I would say that, for probably a small percentage of us, it starts with data, certainly for me. And, I was looking through this report in preparing for this, and I think many of the recommendations are correct. I mean, one of the first questions that I ask is, what are other states doing? How do we compare to how other states approach this? What's been done before? Do we have evidence that this works beyond the anecdotal piece of this?
Well, and just to follow up on that, so I would agree with you that many times it seems that with folks who don't have the background you have, personal stories, anecdotes, et cetera, seem to inform policymaking decisions. What strategies have you found useful in working with your colleagues to say yes and? Like, yes, those are important, but we also need to look at the data and the evidence.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with your previous presenter. It starts by developing those relationships and the trust piece of that. And, identifying who are the coalitions, trusted partners who are working on the issue, because it's hard to receive facts and data if you don't have that trusted resources. And then I think the other critical piece of this is, how is it framed? The framing that will speak to that particular legislator's values. So I'll just give a really good example of this. When I first came into the General Assembly, I was a big and have always been a big advocate of the role of affordable, accessible early childhood care in our communities and what that meant. And often when we talk about that issue, we focus on the data piece of this, which is the return on investment, improved performance in kindergarten readiness and reading guarantee, high school graduation rates, et cetera, where, and frankly, that wasn't really penetrating, I think, with the vast majority, given the makeup of the General Assembly currently. It wasn't until COVID that it became very clear that we needed to bring the business community into this conversation to give the framing of the economic impact of a lack of affordable quality childcare and from a workforce perspective. And that is when we started to see a lot more people starting to come on board with supporting this. I mean, we still have a long way to go, but it was really that economic workforce framing on the issue that I think really was a turning point in how many of my colleagues talk about the issue of childcare.
Thank you for that example. Well, I'm going to go back to Senator Reynolds and ask you the first question, which is, what role do data and research play in your decisions about programs and services? I know in particular, most recently, you've spent a lot of time going out in communities to hear about housing-related issues. And I'm wondering how information related to results has influenced how you take in that information.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Leader Russo, sharing the panel with her this morning. I would say that I came to this role from the community. I'm actually a nonprofit CEO that provides housing to formerly incarcerated men and women who are being adjudicated through the system and coming home and from a housing perspective don't have a place to stay. So I've been doing that for the last 20 years and have served a lot of people in that capacity. And so for me, it always starts with the people. Data and research is a tool that helps frame and help me make informed decisions now coming to the legislature and trying to solve problems. The reason I came to the legislature is because I consider myself an addictive problem solver and someone who likes to see results. However, the problems emanate from the people. I like to say that those that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And so we need data and research to be those essential tools that help us to make those informed decisions and prioritize the resources and to develop the effective policies and programs that meet the needs of the communities that we serve. And so for me, that's where data really comes in, because Leader Russo is correct. I mean, we need to know what are other states doing? How do we tackle this problem? What does the data say, so that we can actually formulate the right policies and the right strategies? But really, to give it the breadth that it needs, the problem starts with the people. And so I really lean on that data and research to be able to help make those informed decisions.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll ask the same follow-up question to you as well. As somebody who is focused on results, what information or approach have you found most useful in your time in the General Assembly with, I guess, advancing programs or initiatives that work with your colleagues?
So I would say, really gleaning it's kind of taking that broad approach of gathering information from all perspectives. I think that's very, very, very important, and allowing people to feel like they're a part of that process. So that's where the qualitative piece comes in for me. With my colleagues on both sides, it's being a bridge builder and allowing people to share their aspect of, what they believe the problem is. But then beyond that, from a data perspective and the quantitative, like really looking at what are the data sets, what does the data inform us, what does it tell us, what is the baseline that we need to build from, allowing, again, people to be a part of that solution. But also identifying the best practices. And I think that that's where data really helps inform and frame, because we can identify what does the research say that's out there that identifies best practices and who else has done this, so that we don't reinvent wheels.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, did you have something to say, Leader Russo? Oh, I thought I heard a noise. So throughout this year, the state agencies will be beginning work on the next biennial budget proposal, and that process will begin next year. So I'm wondering, especially when you're thinking about investment of state resources, what kind of information do you need to know about a program or approach in order to formulate a position or opinion about allocation of resources? And we'll start with Leader Russo. Leader Russo.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So first of all, the budget process never really ends, because these conversations are ongoing, and it's never too early to start having these conversations. But I think, a couple of, I think, key considerations here that are important in answering this question. Number one is that, states have to have, the state of it, we have to have a balanced budget. So we have a finite amount of resources to spend. And so in order to best assess how we spend those resources, data is incredibly important, because it informs how we can most efficiently and effectively use those resources targeted at specific problems. And then when you start to, identify what are the priorities of the problems or issues that you're trying to get at, data again begins to inform us there in terms of where are we going to have the biggest impact with those dollars. I will say one of the challenges, I think, coming from sort of, a research data perspective, especially from the evaluation world, to actual policy making, is, a lot of the work that you do on the evaluation and research and data side, when we look at programs, pilot programs, and look at the outcomes that you often see from interventions, you will not see them for 5 or 10 years, those positive outcomes or the return on investment. The disconnect there is that in the legislative process, and here in the state of Ohio, we're on a biennial budget. So legislators are often looking at only in two years ahead, 2-year increments. And, we have term limits. We may or may not be here after 2 years. So that shift of, investing in programs that may not deliver outcomes for 5 or 10 years, perhaps after you are long gone out of the legislature, and prioritizing that can be a challenge often, I think, for a legislative body, because we're thinking in 2-year terms. Many of the programs that, to have real sustained outcomes, you're not going to see those in 2 years. And so, that is where I think also contextualizing this, framing is incredibly important. Adding the personal piece of this about the people, getting legislators out in the field, talking to people who are truly impacted by investments in these programs is incredibly effective.
And then Senator Reynolds, would you like to build on what Leader Russo said in terms of what information or what you need to know about allocation of resources, state resources in particular?
Absolutely. I think she hit it on the head with respect to the state having limited resources. We only have, so many resources that we can put out, and we have to balance our budget. So I think she very adequately conveyed all of that. I think the only thing that I would add to what she said is alignment with priorities. So I would want to know the data helps inform that the programs actually meet with the broader policy priorities and objectives that we have as a legislative body. And I think that the data actually can really help us tease that out. And if the program seeking that people are presenting to us is seeking to address pressing societal needs and emerging challenges. So we want to make sure that it complements on what our greater policy goals are. And then also a sustainability, if we invest these dollars, is it going to be something that is sustainable so that we can look at the viability of the program and determine whether it's going to be sustainable long-term, which is something that she also spoke about. So I think it's kind of building from there. That alignment is very, very important to make sure that we're doing this uniformly and not necessarily in a vacuum, so that we come back every couple of general assemblies and have to continue to do quick fixes.
Well, one thing I'm struck by that both of you have spoken to, how important it is to both elevate real stories of real people and the impact that these policies have on real people, and couple that with data and evidence, that you can't do one or the other. And I think we heard that from Max as well, that that the messaging matters and personalizing messages matters as well. I want to see, Haley, are there any questions for our panelists in the Q&A box?
None have popped up. So this is a great invitation for all of us on the call. This is a great time to pop questions in the chat. We have just a couple more minutes with our panelists here.
Yeah, and I do have a follow-up question. Senator Reynolds, you mentioned sustainability, and I know that a lot of folks in the practice community struggle with this because both their private sector funders want to see sustainability, and also those who are funding programs with state resources want to see sustainability. So in your mind, what do we mean when we say sustainability? And I think you have a unique perspective given your work out in the field around affordable housing for people who've had criminal justice involvement.
Yeah, so I appreciate that question because it is something that I think takes a very creative and innovative approach. What we mean by sustainability is a financial outlook of the program that can deliver measurable outcomes over time. And what we don't want to do is set people up to fail, that they're going to continue to be invested by a state or government resource. So in order to do that, it takes leveraging public-private partnerships. And that is something that through my nonprofit work, even though it is nonprofit and philanthropic, we were able to do what I coin as private solutions to public problems. And that really invites the private sector to be in the space of helping to solve problems, which is kind of an entrepreneurial take at it. Because like I said, there's very limited resources as it relates to taxpayer dollars. So it really takes all of us, and it takes that approach. So for sustainability, as we saw trending over the last several years, at least in the nonprofit space, we've seen social enterprises. So like a model, for instance, of like a Goodwill, if you will. They have a very philanthropic aspect. It's a charity where they're helping individuals with developmental disabilities, but they also then have a market-based store that is like like a free store or a store where people, the market can actually come in, customers can come in and buy things. So we're looking at ways that we can make sure that there are strong legs, not just from the public side, but the private side, because we know that priorities shift in the legislature all the time. There's different issues that emerge, and different leaders come in with, and there's different issues that arise. And so we have to make sure that we can rise to those occasions. And my passion has always been reentry and housing, and I've had to do the very same things over the last 20 years. I couldn't just rely on the fact that the nonprofit does do some state and federal and county contracting. We've had to go out there and do some things on the private side, which amounted to rental housing and home ownership and things like that. So I just think really helping programs as they emerge start to look at what can we do to leverage that market-based approach, then we can help make sure that everyone is in it for the long term and that we have sustainable outcomes.
So Amy, I absolutely agree with a lot of what Senator Reynolds is saying. I mean, sustainability, predictability is incredibly important. And those public-private partnerships are helpful in the space. That said, I do also feel that as legislators, when we're looking at funding priorities, we also have to evaluate the cost of inaction or not prioritizing, because there is a cost to inaction as well. And often that cost of inaction from the public sector is significantly greater in the long term than the immediate fix. And so, having data on that piece and evaluation on that piece is incredibly important, and I say we've got Director McElroy coming up next, but, especially when we're looking in the space of our aging population and how we deal with many of the issues around long-term care, there's all kinds of evidence that if you don't do some of the spending in places up front, you're going to, in the long term, pay much more because of the acuity of care needed that ultimately comes out of the state coffers.
Well, thank you, Leader Russo, and thank you, Senator Reynolds, for spending your time with us today. Your decades of experience coupled with your knowledge from serving in these leadership roles was very insightful today, and we appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend. Yeah, you're welcome.
Amy, as we transition from that panel to our next one, this would be a great time to throw a poll question for our audience. We'd love to know how you felt about the first half of our event today. If you could scroll through and answer some of these questions for us as our next panel gets situated, that would be excellent.
Yeah, thank you, Haley. I was supposed to tee this up before the legislative panel, but I got so excited about going into the legislative panel that I forgot.
All good.
So there are multiple questions here. You may need to scroll down in order to respond to all of them. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our executive branch panel. This is our final set of panelists, and we're so glad that so many of you, we had really high attendance for today's webinar, and we're very pleased that many of you have stayed with us to this part of the webinar, which I know is going to be as insightful as the rest of the webinar has been. So first I'll do some quick introductions. We have with us today Bill Beagle, who is a former legislator and is also the current Director of Policy and Program Administration with the Ohio Treasurer Robert Sprague's office. He served a total of 8 years in the Ohio Senate. And then we're also joined by 3 state agency leaders. We have Director Ursel McElroy from the Ohio Department of Aging, Deputy Director Marissa Weisel from the Ohio Department of Medicaid, and Director Kara Wente from the new Ohio Department of Children and Youth. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to start our conversation today with Director McElroy. So, Director, the current state plan on aging sets a bold goal that all Ohioans live longer, healthier lives with dignity and autonomy, and that disparities and inequities are eliminated. The state plan also includes many evidence-informed strategies to achieve this goal. Why was it important to you, because I know it was important to you, to use the state plan on aging to guide funding decisions? And how has the Department of Aging operationalized this approach?
So thank you, Amy, for having me here today. And thank you for the question. For the audience, we did contract with HPIO to help us in the development of this state plan. And as the federally designated state unit on aging, our department is required to periodically submit a state plan on aging. And this plan helps us to draw down federal funds. For a bit of background, as Amy pointed out, our vision, our goals within the plan are quite bold. I think she rattled them off to you, that we really believe that every Ohioan should live longer, healthier lives with dignity and autonomy. And we certainly do want to see inequities eliminated. Our state plan, by way of information, has been held up nationally as a peer-reviewed best practice example for other states. And I think in part that's because our plan includes opportunities for both public and private partners to do something to help us make a difference in this considerable effort. Our state plan has not been mere guesswork. We hosted many listening sessions throughout the state. Our needs assessment process was quite robust with surveys, focus groups, looking at data, doing research. And we did this to ensure that we were targeting the right things within the state plan. And so after having this critical data gathering process, the thought was, now how do we operationalize this? We set forth targets that I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about here later throughout the panel. But our targets are ones that were both short-term, intermediate, and long-term. And so when we began to look at the state budget process, as you heard from our legislators, it is a process that has a lot of different dynamics that we had to contemplate. We know that the state plan is the framework by which we can have collective impact, both short-term and long-term. We know that our state plan is full of evidence-informed strategies, so it was built for success. We know through our state plan those populations that should be prioritized because we've seen gaps in the services to those populations at this time. So we believe our plan is relatable. We believe our plan is understandable. We believe our plan takes the best data and translates it into really powerful action that will show a return on investment right now and in the future. So I thought it was really important to make sure that people could coalesce around it, that they could continue to monitor our progress. Each year we have updates on how we're doing. And so I think my final point I want to make on this, why the state plan was so important, is that oftentimes during the budget process, I find that there is a rush to get funding for a particular program and initiative. Mm-hmm. This is the long view. We are very clear what we're trying to accomplish, and it is a compilation of all of those things rolled up that public, private can all be a part of this solution. Mm-hmm. And so whether you pick this plan up today, if you pick it up 5 years from now, you will see our progress, you will see how those outcomes are being tracked, and you will see the big picture. And the return on investment will be quite obvious.
Thank you, Director. Next, we'll go to Director Wente. The mission of the new department is to promote positive lifelong outcomes for youth through early intervention, quality education, and family support programs. How is evidence of effectiveness used to make decisions about programs that are now within the purview of the Department of Children and Youth, such as home visiting and early childhood education?
That is a great question, and one that we had to think a lot about when we started to even talk about creating the new department. So as you mentioned, the new department was signed into law in the last budget 234 days ago. And I was glad to hear Representative Russo say the budget process never stops, because that's certainly the way it feels. But you know, we were excited when we had the opportunity to bring these programs together to take a different approach. We not only get to look at the program from start to finish, but we really get to take on the task of what Governor DeWine always leads with, I feel like, in conversations around kids and making sure they reach their full potential, meaning that we need to look at it as a continuum. And when we look at our programs as a continuum, you not only get to measure what if home visiting is really being implemented to fidelity, because the great news is we use evidence-based practice, and we can look at, based on research, you know, how many sessions do most families need? What does it look like from a professional standpoint? And then we can track those outcomes, and we have an independent third-party evaluation that's underway for home visiting. But we also want to look at some of what you heard from the legislative panel, those individual metrics based for families. Meaning, when we talk about the continuum, we can bucket our services among awareness, prevention, intervention, and wellness. That's kind of the quadrants we use to talk about all of the services and supports coming to the new department. But underlying all of those are metrics that we should start to see moving the needle around. You know, are we seeing fewer DYS commitments long term? Are we seeing better kindergarten readiness scores? You know, one of the major metrics around early childhood education, and again, it made my heart sing and feel warm and fuzzy this morning to hear the example around childcare, because certainly when we look at our early care and education programs, we are always looking at the kindergarten readiness assessment. Where are our kids? Are they emerging, approaching, demonstrating? Are we recovering from the pandemic? We know that from the pandemic, we saw a drop in the number of kids demonstrating. How do we start to make sure that those numbers go back in the right direction? Our continuum should help with that. When you're talking about measuring specific effectiveness, it's not just measuring what children are getting the service. Certainly that's a good starting point and a place to see that needle move when you expand access and capacity. But I think the other piece is really looking at those outcome metrics, whether it's the kindergarten readiness assessment, better attendance, not only for the child, but the other component that's already been brought up is around early education can be looked at as a workforce support. So are we seeing more parents in the labor force? Are we seeing them with better attendance? Some of that can't be measured statewide, but as we've already heard on this session today, hearing specifically from employers and engaging in those public-private conversations around what are you experiencing in your specific organization, and then talking directly with families. So oftentimes we get hung up on the major metrics, which are wonderful, and longitudinal data is fantastic, but so often we don't have time to really look at that. I think one of the other pieces is really celebrating those smaller wins. So I'll give you a quick example. In the last budget, we were able to expand eligibility for childcare from 142% of the federal poverty level to 145%. 3% didn't feel like a lot, but I can tell you sitting here today, to more than 700 children, that means the world to them, because they're not only getting a quality educational setting, but their parents have the ability to go to work or to go to school. And that's in the first quarter of implementation. We expect that number to get over 2,000. And yes, when we're talking about kids, whether it's 700, 2,000, or 2.5 million, we try to track that to make sure that we're not only looking at the individual specific cases for families, but the broader approach, and having both is really what's going to balance our success, but also allow us to have those critical conversations around what more do we need to do to fill the service gap and better stabilize that family.
I really appreciate you highlighting the importance of celebrating smaller scale wins. We did a study last year on the economic impact of eliminating disparities across a wide array of metrics, and it was a huge number that could be realized. And we were able to eliminate all racial and ethnic disparities by tomorrow. We achieved like millions of dollars in savings in our state. But one of the key messages that we've been championing is that anything is important, and anything we can do can increase that likelihood of economic vitality in the long run. So we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And looking at those small wins is a good way to remind ourselves of that.
Amy, you channeled the sign that's across the wall from me that says, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good." We got to remind ourselves of that. We got to start somewhere.
Absolutely. Okay, and then maybe somebody on my team could put the number, the economic impact number in the chat, since I couldn't bring it up right away. So Bill, according to Treasurer Sprague's website, Results Ohio is an infrastructure within the Treasurer's office that enables policymakers and innovators to pursue pay-for-success projects aimed at tackling the most pressing social and public health challenges facing Ohio. So in light of that, we're interested in knowing how data and evidence is used in the Results Ohio project.
Sure. Good morning, and thanks for having me. Just a quick background on what Results Ohio is for the audience, and that will help understand how we use data. But Results Ohio was a Pay for Success project, Pay for Success program that was authorized by the General Assembly in 2019. And the Treasurer's goal was to encourage the application of private sector solutions to public sector problems, by shifting the financial risk of pilot projects from the taxpayer onto the private sector. And that's done by having the private sector, which is oftentimes philanthropy, funding a project through its lifetime. Outcomes with all the parties are established up front. It's put into a contract that all the parties sign. Our office hires a third-party evaluator to determine if the metrics were made, and if therefore repayment to the private sector funder is made. In terms of data, a Results Ohio project is going to generate data that's collected in the field because of some intervention being performed, and then ultimately submitted to this evaluator who analyzes it, compiles it, and then makes the determination about payment or not payment. But we use data in other ways as well. Outcome data can be difficult to obtain. Patient data, for example, student data. There's some things for privacy reasons that can make outcome data challenging. Mm-hmm. But we have been able to use some high quality research from reputable institutions that have been helpful to us in establishing a link between data that we have available and the outcomes that the project partners want to see. And this helps us establish, the proper outcomes. And it also helps us in talking with members of the General Assembly about a particular project. For example, the IC project that we did is a mobile vision clinic down visiting Title I schools in Appalachia. So there's already research by Johns Hopkins and UCLA that has established that children who can see properly with glasses have better academic outcomes. Their outcomes improve. So in explaining the project to General Assembly members whose support we needed in the budget, we spoke about improving the access to glasses. Because we know that they're going to do better in school. So the problem to be solved is about getting them the glasses, not so much convincing them that once they have them, they're going to do better academically, because that data is going to be a little harder to get a hold of. So, we can measure things in that particular project about the number of eye exams, how many kids get referred to an optician, how many people see those, how many get their glasses, and so on and so forth. Those are things we can actually measure. So by having, quality research from reputable institutions, it can help us, find maybe, proxy data, I guess I'd call it, to find things that can impact, can demonstrate the interventions
Mm-hmm.
are actually working out in the field. So that's a quick answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Very helpful. Now we'll move on to Marissa. Marissa, the Ohio Department of Medicaid provides healthcare coverage for more than 3 million Ohioans and aims to improve health and wellness and health outcomes for people with Medicaid coverage. At ODM, what kind of data is most important and compelling for you to receive about an innovative approach, pilot program, when considering investing Medicaid resources?
Thanks, Amy. At ODM, as we cover so many people and we have such a large financial commitment to the people of Ohio and to committing taxpayer resources to folks across the state, it's really important for us to think about using our resources really efficiently and effectively. So one of the best ways that folks can communicate to us that what they're doing will matter in our program is to look at our quality strategy that already exists. We've put a lot of resources and time and thought into our quality strategy that it aims to improve population health, to drive value and lower costs, to improve patient experience and provider satisfaction and address disparities. And so if you look at our materials and you see what we're already interested in changing, and you can help us row our boats all in the same direction rather than pick a new project or metric that we're not trying to move, that's really helpful. We also base everything that we do in our quality improvement space in quality improvement science. So if you think about how you're developing your research, even if it's sort of small scale, thinking about how you've really based that in the needs of a population, you've developed SMART goals, and you've measured those, that's compelling to us as we think about evaluating something to bring into our program. The second most important thing, I think, is demonstrated improvements in your research or your data for health outcomes for people who have Medicaid or similar populations, either in our state or in other states, with a focus on reducing disparities even within Medicaid. We're really interested in solving the toughest problems, and sometimes picking, low-hanging fruit is great, but also we're always trying to figure out how to get at the trickier challenges within the healthcare space. And then the last thing that I think is the most important to us is, again, a good investment or return on investment over the long haul. That doesn't necessarily mean we need to save money, this moment, but in a biennium is helpful, or in a couple bienniums. And then also thinking about those longer term outcomes that the directors have both mentioned, those are really important to us to move. So if you can talk to us about how investments or changing something with our child population will produce lasting educational outcomes for them, that's return on investment for taxpayer dollars across our systems, not even just within the healthcare space.
That's really interesting, because one of the things we heard from Leader Russo is that the General Assembly may be focused more on the span of their term, whereas the state agency may be more inclined to look at the longer view. So I think that's important for our audience to understand, is that how you're engaging with people who work in state agencies will be different than how you engage with legislators or legislative aides. So now I think we'll see if there's any questions in the Q&A box. And while we're letting you have a chance to put those in the Q&A box, I would love to hear your thoughts on what can get in the way of scaling up innovative approaches. We know that there's lots of work going on around our state to actually creatively problem solve and test whether things are working. So when something has shown positive results, what do you think can be a barrier to spreading that more broadly? And I'll start with Director McElroy.
So I think what we heard from the legislative panel was really great, in that it helps to understand some of the dynamics and how some of those things certainly come into play. From my perspective, I think the understanding the climate is really important, so that you can align your messaging as appropriate. I think appreciating that some funding is more predictable than others, and where you have those more unpredictable sources, I think that is much more of a challenge. I'd also I think one of the things we haven't said is resources. I think it's really important that our state agencies and our legislature really have an investment or a commitment to data professionals, data scientists, not only those who can collect the information, but who can properly analyze it and then help translate that into what's necessary. And I wouldn't take for granted that we are rich in that supply. In fact, I think that's an area where we can continue to grow and improve. And so when I look at all of those things, and then finally, I think who's ever going after funding, understand that data is a strategic asset. It can't stand on its own. And by that, I mean, you have to have a story with it. You have to help people understand why it's so important. And I believe just like you and I as human beings, we want to eat every day, right? So what do I mean by that? So you have to have those milestones. You have to feed the story and help people understand bit by bit. We appreciate the end game, but throughout, showing people how their investments work. And I mean the people, I mean the public, I mean the private sector, I mean our public partners, I mean our legislature. So I think there are a lot of things that you can do to compensate for some of the challenges, as long as you're aware that the challenges exist and you're strategic in how you approach them.
Okay, thank you. Director Wente, what thoughts do you have on this question?
The only thing I would add is if it's setting the story at the end and having those strategic milestones, but it's also setting expectations at the front end. So often we don't give our time to actually build capacity, implement, and then evaluate. And it's really being clear up front that when you're starting a pilot, your runway is going to be a little longer than any of us want, but it's going to be worth it to slow down to then speed up later. And I think just being clear about that up front is key. And then of course, you know, actually building in the timeline to build capacity. So often we go out and assume that we're going to spend 2 years of funding in a program because it's how we estimate the uptake. But we all know that everyone doesn't walk in on day one. So making it clear and setting those expectations and then doing the best job you can to communicate the data frequently and transparently. Just because telling that story often is going to be necessary to help people understand and to buy in.
Okay, great. So, Bill, what thoughts do you have about the barriers that can get in the way? And I'm thinking that you might have some thoughts from your experience as a legislator as well.
True. So yeah, so to be clear, in case this gets subpoenaed later, I am speaking on, not so much as a Treasury employee, as much as a former state legislator. Some of the barriers that we saw are around, for example, capacity. I can think of, you can have a successful project at a local level, but is there a capacity to take it larger, into a larger scale? And that's, the delivery of interventions, delivery of services, but also leadership. Sometimes, especially at the local level, as a legislator, you're thinking, this leader is outstanding, but, when you want to go 8 counties away, will you have that type of leadership? And as a single legislator, you're bound by scale. Good luck for me walking in and asking the Senate president for $125 million for something. I mean, there's sometimes scale can be an issue, and a legislator can't be the key to every door, and so you need to find other ways or collaborations where you can get a critical mass where a substantial ask can be doable.
Okay, great. That's interesting to your comment about capacity, because especially as there have been workforce challenges here in Ohio, I know that capacity concern has been an issue in the nonprofit sector, because often resources are limited, and so ability to recruit, attract, retain employees to even implement something that works, and even something where there's funding for it can be limited too. So thanks for bringing that up. And let's see, Marissa, we'll let you close out this question around barriers.
I don't have much to add to the astute points made by my colleagues. We get examples of programs where a grandma has gone out and knocked doors and just done phenomenal work and actually really improved outcomes because of the relationships that she's been able to build in her community. And it's often difficult to replicate those kinds of amazing results based on the work of one person, especially when they're not fully embedded into the systems that we have. When, if you try to do something statewide, you're going to have to enroll people as Medicaid providers, and that's a pain. Thinking through, especially in the Medicaid space where we've got, heavy federal regulations and state regulations too, as we think about how we spend our dollars and pay for services, there are often barriers in actually, scaling services when we think about some of the people who are best at doing the work. So Medicaid is a wonderful tool and vehicle and can be really positive in making change, but it is also not always the easiest method to get funding out the door for specific types of projects.
Right. I hear you. Haley, are there questions in the Q&A?
No, none have come in.
All right. Well, any last thoughts from any of our panelists before we close out? Anything you wish I would have asked you but didn't? All right. Well, hearing none, we want to close by saying how appreciative we are of all of you in your commitment to data and evidence and your leadership here in our state. And we also are appreciative of your time spent sharing your thoughts with our audience today. So thank you. Thank you all very much for being with us. And last, we're going to just close out with a slide with some additional food for thought for you. And this, we put this slide up in all of our webinars, but it's particularly relevant today as the entire focus of today's webinar has been on engagement with policymakers. So there are many ways that you can influence policy, both as a regular person out in the world and as a representative of your organization. So I want to stress the importance of relationship building with elected officials. A great place to start is working with the elected officials that represent you where you live or where your organization is. There was an earlier question about how legislators prefer to receive information. And one of the things we've learned over time is that it really depends on the legislator. Some people like to receive emails, other people like to receive hard copies. But one thing that seems universal is that when a legislator knows the person and has had multiple interactions, they are more likely to trust the information that is being brought to them. So there's really simple ways to do that. Depending on your setting, it may make sense to invite folks from the executive branch or the legislative branch to come visit your program or your organization. Another way is through giving legislative testimony, of course, writing letters. The more personalized those letters are, the better. I think Max put something in the chat about how they found that even having a typo in a message increases the likelihood that it'll be paid attention to, which is, I don't know, super hard for me, like theoretically. I mean, of course, I frequently make typos, but like I aim to not make typos. But to learn that, well, maybe that's even better is an insight that I didn't know before today. So please think about ways that you can influence policy and also make policymakers aware of the importance of data and evidence in the work that you're doing. We have one final poll question or a set of poll questions for you. And this is about how you plan to use the information presented on today's forum. So please scroll through these questions to make sure that you respond to all of them. We really do appreciate you staying with us throughout today's event, and we utilize the feedback we receive to plan future events So please take a moment to do this. And then again, one final reminder, the materials from today's webinar, including the publications and slides and other resources, are available on our website, which is hpio.net. Let's see, the poll questions are still up, so please continue to respond. And then once we close out the poll, we'll show you some other ways that you can stay connected with our work. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can connect with us through our email list, which you will now be on since you joined today's forum if you weren't already today. Well, thank you all for attending our forum. I hope you found it as helpful as I did, and that you have a few key takeaways that you can use in your work going forward. Thank you and enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Amy. Since there's so many poll questions, they're still coming in. So we'll just give you guys
great.
to do that. At the end, you will also have a survey pop up so you can give some qualitative feedback as well.
Great.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.